Behold, said Andreth, did I not say that ye do not know death? Lo, when you are made to face it in thought only, as we know it in deed, and in thought all our lives, at once you fall into a despair. We know, if ye do not, that the Nameless is Lord of this world, and your valor and ours too is a folly, or at least it is fruitless. Beware, said Finrod, beware lest you speak the unspeakable, wittingly or in ignorance, confounding Eru with the enemy, who would fain have you do so. The Lord of this world is not he, but the one who made him, and his vice-regent is Manwa, the elder king of Arda, who is blessed. Nay, Andreth, the mind darkened and distraught, to bow and yet to loathe, to flee and yet not to reject, to love the body and yet scorn it, the carrion disgust, these things may come from the Morgoth indeed, but to doom the deathless to death, from father unto son, and yet to lead to them the memory of an inheritance taken away, and the desire for what is lost, could the Morgoth do this? No, I say, and for that reason I said that if your tale is true, then all in Arda is vain, from the pinnacle of Oilissa to the uttermost abyss. For I do not believe your tale. None could have done this save the one. Therefore I say to you, Andreth, what did ye do, ye men, long ago in the dark? How did ye anger Eru? For otherwise all your tales are but dark dreams devised in a dark mind. Will you say what you know or have heard? I will not, said Andreth. We do not speak of this to those of other race. But indeed the wise are uncertain and speak with contrary voices. For whatever happened long ago, we have fled from it. We have tried to forget. And so long have we tried that now we cannot remember any time when we were not as we are, save only legends of days when death came less swiftly, and our span was still far longer. But already there was death. Ye cannot remember, said Finrod. Are there no tales of your days before death, though ye will not tell them to strangers? Maybe, said Andreth, if not among my folk, then among the folk of Adenel, perhaps. She fell silent and gazed at the fire. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. Why, in the stories of the Silmarillion and of Middle-earth, should there be no story of the fall of man? Now, what I just read to you is from the text that I've been gesturing towards for some time, this Athrabeth, Finrod Andreth, conversation of Finrod and Andreth, which Tolkien wrote, or it seems there are notes for it, from 1959 after he finished The Lord of the Rings, and I mean, he's still drafting the Silmarillion because he never manages to publish it during his lifetime, and wrestling with the great mystery of why men die. Now, Finrod is an elf. He is brother to Galadriel and to Egnor, who is the beloved of Andreth, who's a woman. She's a wise woman of the House of Beor. And this conversation is set during the siege of Angband. It's set in this period when Andreth is fallen in love with Egnor, and she's frustrated because he won't marry her and stay with her. And Finrod they're talking about death and the problem of the relationship between elves and men, which we're going to have to hold off on for a moment, because what I want to focus on today is this refusal that Andreth, as the wise woman, the house of Beor, who Beor is, sorry, I get lost in all of these genealogies myself. The House of Beor is, of course, Berin's family, and Beren is going to marry Luthien. So we are going to have a man and elf marriage, but it's not going to be Andreth and Egnor, to her frustration and sorrow. But she and Agnor's brother, Finrod, who's also Galadriel's brother, are having this conversation about, I mean, why should it be that the elves live so much longer than the human beings, and why should the human beings die? And what Finrod is saying in the passage I just read to you, Andreth is pushing him, saying, you know, you even here speaking of death, and you're suddenly unable to face it even in thinking, right? That you don't want to consider what it means to die and leave the bounds of Arda, whatever that means. And Finrod says, well, but how can you say that this power is something that the enemy, that the Melkor, the Morgoth, Melkor, the Morgoth, has been given? You men must have done something, right? And he says, what did you do, ye men, long ago in the dark? How did you anger Eru? And Andreth won't say. This is a puzzle, and it's a puzzle that Tolkien is somewhat aware of himself, because he's setting up this conversation between the elf and the woman, and wanting them to wrestle with the problem of what happens to human beings after death, which the elves don't know. But having Andreth, even as a wise woman, not, sort of being embarrassed, having her not willing to say what it is that she's heard from possibly the people of Adenel, and we're going to find out that Tolkien does draft the tale of Adenel, which gives a stab, as it were, at this problem. But even in his notes here, he's so hesitant. We've been saying for episode after episode, dozens of episodes now, 36 episodes, that Tolkien considered his legendarium to be fundamentally Christian. Certainly something written for someone, to be acceptable to a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity. And yet, he says, not only that, believable to a mind that acceptable to a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity. And as we've been talking about for at least a dozen episodes now, I've lost track, from it to episode 21 forward, he's been basically writing the fall, right, over and over and over again. And he even explained in his letter to Milton Waldman, when he's making this grand sketch of his mythology, of his cosmological story, that there is no story, at least for a human storyteller, there cannot be any story without a fall. And we said this, that after all, I believe that legends and myths are largely made of truth, and indeed present aspects of it that can only be received in this mode. And long ago certain truths and modes of this kind were discovered and must always reappear. So you've heard me read this passage before, but he's saying there are truths in this kind of story that always must reappear, and one of them is the fall. There cannot be any story without a fall. All stories are ultimately about the fall, at least not for human minds as we know them and have them. And yet, Tolkien, the great Catholic storyteller, the great Christian mythologist, refuses to put the fall of man in his own legendarium. Now we will get, you guys got to stick with me, because we're in here for the long haul now. We will get to the story of Numenor, and obviously there is a story of temptation and fall in the story of Numenor, but that's already, as it were, within history. That there, and maybe think about, how many times can we fall as human beings? That the Sauron tempts the Numenorians, and it brings on the flood, but that's as it were well into Genesis, right? That's well into building the Tower of Babel and wanting to reach up to the heavens, that the Numenorians defy death. They want it somehow to preserve themselves immortal. But they're already living within Ardamart. That's the entire point of their being in Numenor, that they've helped the elves in the great battle against the Morgoth, against the enemy. And so they're given a gift of the land to live in. And okay, so that fall, we've sort of gestured towards it back when we were talking about the Notion Club papers and the great wave that Tolkien saw in his dreams, right? The dream Atlantis. Okay, that is a fall story, but there is in fact in the legendarium, as well, mostly written, it's like we'll see a story today that almost does it. No story of the fall of human beings in the first place, right? And Tolkien, in his précis of the legendarium to Milton Waldman, says this explicitly. So he says, so proceeding, he's been outlining the whole arc of the story for Waldman, right? And so proceeding, the elves have a fall before their history can become storial. And we've just been talking about that, when the making of Fëanor and the marring of Fëanor. And once, Fëanor comes under the great doom of Manwë for killing his kin, and we should have the doom of Manwë, that Manwë tells him, tears unnumbered ye shall shed, and the Valar will fence Valinor against you and shut you out, so that not even the echo of your lamentation shall pass over the mountains. Ye have spilled the blood of your kindred unrighteously, and have stained the land of Aman. For blood ye shall render blood, and beyond Aman you shall dwell in death's shadow. For though Eru appointed to you to die not in Ea, and no sickness may assail you, yet slain ye may be, and slain ye shall be, by weapon and by torment and by grief, and your houseless spirit shall then come to Mandos. There long shall ye abide, and yearn for your bodies, and find little pity, though all whom ye have slain should entreat for you. And those that endure in Middle Earth and come not to Mandos shall grow weary of the world, as with a great burden, and shall wane and become as shadows of regret before the younger race that cometh after. The Valar have spoken. And that is, of course, what Finrod in this conversation with Andreth is referring to. It's like, what did you do? Because he knows what Fëanor did, and he knows what curse he and the other elves are living under for following Fëanor, right? Who is his cousin, half cousin. Finrod knows what Fëanor. Please, you guys got to memorize all these genealogies for me, because I'm going to forget. Finrod knows what Fëanor did. Finrod knows what all of the elves who followed Fëanor out of Valinor to, get back the Silmarils did. And he knows the doom that Manwë has spoken, and saying, for though Eru appointed you to die not, by weapon and by torment and by grief you shall be slain. And Finrod is saying that, Eru likewise made the men, the men and elves are both children of Ilúvatar in this story, and saying to Andreth, there's nothing that the Morgoth could not have transformed your being so effectively to make you be able to die if in fact you were made not to die. So there is the fall of the elves in the story, and we've spent several episodes considering what Tolkien was trying to explore through Fëanor's possessiveness of his own creation, right? But here with the men, back in the letter to Waldman, parenthetically, Tolkien simply says there's no story of the fall of human beings. Parentheses. The first fall of man, for reasons explained, nowhere appears. Men do not come on the stage until all that is long past. And there is only a rumor that for a while they fell under the domination of the enemy, and that some reprinted. The main body of the tale, the Silmarillion proper, is about the fall of the most gifted kindred of the elves. This should be fundamentally unsatisfying. If this is a Christian story, how can you possibly go against sort of every theological and narrative inclination to wrap in metaphor and make visible the metaphor of the effects of sin and free will, and not tell the story of the fall, right? I've sort of been aware of this for a long time, right? But it was only really in thinking about today's episode that I said, wait a minute, There's no story of the fall of man in Tolkien's legendarium. It seems to go against everything we have said thus far. Why not? And this like he sort of Tolkien makes it with Waldman a kind of, well, yeah, of course it's the Elvish story. And to be fair, in narrative terms, this makes some sense, right? The Silmarillion is the story within the fiction of the legendarium, written down by Bilbo, that he learned at the House of Elrond, of the stories that were told by the elves. Insofar as they know about creation, it's told to them by the Valar. And so, well, sure, it's the Elvish perspective, so why would you have a story of the fall of man? And in fact, in the Silmarillion, men come on the stage. I mean, they've been prophesied, as it were, in the music, in the Ainulindale, saying that there will be these followers, right? The elves are the firstborn, and the human beings, Hildor, the followers, and that they are both sung in the music as children of Ilúvatar, right? So for the children of Ilúvatar were conceived by him alone, and they came with the third theme. You're going to have to go back to the beginning of the episodes of the music of the Ainur to get this bit, but they came with the third theme, and were not in the theme which Ilúvatar propounded at the beginning, and none of the Ainur had part in their making. So the Ainur, and this is what Finrod is also pointing to, the Ainur, or Valar, do not make the elves. Manwë pronounces doom on the elves for their sin, but it's, they've sinned against Eru greatly, so it's not the Valar themselves who are changing the nature of the elves to making them able to die. It's the doom that they brought on themselves by Feanor's treachery and kinslaying. And so none of the Ainur have a part in their making. Therefore, when the Ainur beheld the children, the more did they love them, being things other than themselves, strange and free, wherein they saw the mind of Ilúvatar reflected anew. Right? We are, this fits with, the creation story, that we as human beings are made in the image and likeness, and here in the Ainulindale, the Ainur see the children of Ilúvatar, both elves and men, reflected. They saw the mind of Ilúvatar reflected in these children, and learned yet a little more of his wisdom, which otherwise had been hidden even from the Ainur. Which thinking about us as human beings, and from a Christian perspective, if we're all made in the image and likeness of God, why aren't we all identical? Well, because how could any one human being, obviously, contain the whole of God? And we as children, made in the image and likeness of God, all reflect parts, maybe the whole. I mean, maybe we're all holographs of the mind, or the whatever not even mind of God, right? We're all holographs of the image and likeness of God, but somehow carry only a splintered fragment of that part. And we've seen the way Tolkien imagines the elves as showing us that rainbow-hued, reflecting, right? That you scatter the image and likeness through the prism of our history, and become more able to see more of Ilúvatar through all of those different characters. Well, okay, so the Ainur see yet a little more of Ilúvatar's wisdom reflected in these children. Now the children of Ilúvatar are elves and men, the firstborn and the followers. So they're in the story. The Valar know about the coming of the men, just as they knew about the elves. But with the elves, of course, as we saw, the Valar get impatient, and they go looking for them, and bring some of them back to Valinor so they can enjoy being with them. In the Silmarillion, and this episode is to make you really kind of frustrated. Like, wait a minute, Tolkien left something out. Well, yes, rather something big, and potentially undoes everything that we've been talking about this far. But okay, stick with me, right? That curiously enough, because Tolkien is so committed to the elvish perspective in the Silmarillion, he and also in the long run to a story in which elves and men commingle, right? Beren and Luthien and Tuor and Idril and therefore Aragorn and Arwen in the long run. I mean, the grand dramas of Tolkien's legendarium are these marriages of elves and men. So you'd think he'd want some more of the backstory of what it means to be a human being, given that they are central characters for him. But no, it all happens off stage. So the Valar, the elves, some of the elves have stayed in Valinor, and they're still there. The Noldor have left, and they're now in Middle-earth and Beleriand, and wars are raging with the Morgoth and dragons, and there's still lots of story to come. But the Valar are they're kind of sulking, right? The Valar sat now behind their mountains at peace, and having given light to Middle-earth, they left for long untended, and the lordship of Morgoth was uncontested save by the Valar of the Noldor. The Valar don't even participate in the early wars with Morgoth. They've kind of left the Noldor on their own. They've given light to Middle-earth because now we have in mythical terms the beginning of history. That the trees have been killed by Ungoliant, and Morgoth has taken the Silmarils, and the light of the Silmarils is the light of the trees is still in the Silmarils, but the trees themselves have died, and we have only now the sun and the moon, whose light is much sullied in comparison with the light of the trees. The sun is the last Anar, the last fruit of Laurelin, and the guided in the sky by Aryan. What's interesting in this is Tolkien has gendered the sun and the moon in reverse, right? The sun is gendered she, as it were, and the moon is gendered he. So Aryan guides the vessel of the sun, carrying this ship carrying the fruit of Laurelin, and Tilion guides the moon, which carries the vessel of the moon, which carries Isil, the flower of Telperion. And so we have, in fact, the beginning of time, right? We have now the sun years begin with the launching of these two ships, and it's with the sun. This is very significant for the structuring of the place of humanity within the legendarium. It's with the sun that the human beings wake up, right? So you remember that what we saw with the elves is they wake in the starlight. They wake as children of the stars. The first thing they see is the stars. They sing to Elbereth as the star kindler, right? And their journey from the lake where they wake up under the starlight towards the light of the trees is, stimulated by the desire of the Valar to share with them that light. Well, that light's gone. So as you say, human beings have never seen the light of the trees. The only vision that human beings can have, the men, and saying men is actually more appropriate to Tolkien's legendarium than human beings. I mean, we're talking about humanity, but it's the elves and the men. The men in the story can only see the light of the trees as it's captured in the Silmarils, and ultimately in the story only in the light of Arendelle, the star. So they've never known the light of Valinor, and they can't know it because it's gone. And they wake up with the sun, right? And it says, from this time forth were reckoned the years of the sun. Swifter and briefer are they than the long years of the trees in Valinor. In that time the air of Middle-earth became heavy with the breath of growth and mortality, and the changing and aging of all things was hastened exceedingly. Life teemed upon the soil and in the waters in the second spring of Arda, and the Eldar increased, and beneath the new sun Beleriand grew green and fair. At the first rising of the sun, the younger children of Ilúvatar awoke in the land of Hildorian in the eastward regions of Middle-earth. Hildorian just means the land of the followers, right? That Hildor is the follower. So they wake up in the far east, and the light they see is the sun. But I'm confused about this. But is it the first sun arose in the west, and the opening eyes of the men were turned towards it, and their feet as they wandered over the earth for the most part strayed that way, right? So I don't get which direction the sun's moving. I mean, maybe it's they wake up. No, I don't know how Tolkien's imagining this. The Earth's still flat at this point, so the ships of the sun and the moon are traveling in the sky, and the men wake up in their own east and want to travel towards the light of the sun, just as the elves had woken up under the stars and wanted to, once they were told of the light of the trees, want to go there, right? And so all of it, again, we're still sort of aiming towards the light, but this second people is rather feeble compared to the Eldar, and the thing is, they're feeble from the beginning, right? As Tolkien's saying, he put no story of the fall in his legendarium. The Atani, they were named by the Eldar, the second people, but they called them also Hildor, the followers, and many other names, and the other names aren't that complimentary. Aponinor, the afterborn, Engwar, the sickly, and Firamar, the mortals. And they named them the usurpers, the strangers, and the inscrutable, the self-cursed, the heavy-handed, the night-fearers, the children of the sun. So, from the Elvish perspective, and therefore it's, the more remarkable that Finrod has this conversation with Andreth at all, calling her wise woman and giving her credit, although obviously in the long run some of the elves learn to respect the men, sort of. But from the Elvish perspective, the men are just weak, right? And self-cursed. But they don't understand why, and nobody ever says, right? Of men little is told in these tales which concern the eldest days before the waxing of mortals and the waning of the elves, save of those fathers of men, the Atanatari, who in the first years of the sun and the moon wandered into the north of the world. To Hildorian there came no Vala to guide men or to summon them to dwell in Valinor, and men have feared the Valar rather than loved them, and have not understood the purposes of the powers, being at variance with them and at strife with the world. So both the men wake up in the sun time. They're already when the elves meet them, cursed and self-cursed and mortal, and the Valar take no interest in them. At least they attempt not to guide them at all. They don't try to bring them to Valinor, and men in this understanding simply fear them. Which as a footnote is kind of like, well, then these Valar don't really function terrifically well as the pagan deities, since obviously in human history mankind does worship divine beings, as they call them, other than the creator. So whatever similarity this Valinorian mythology has to the Olympian gods or some such, in Tolkien's world it doesn't hold, because the Valar never really take much interest in the human beings. He does say Olmo sends them messages by water, but otherwise the Valar simply don't exist for they exist for the human beings, but the human beings don't know anything about them. So to that extent we could say, well, okay, Tolkien is simply sticking with his sorry, I've blanked on my thought, because I saw my next note, and it's good go on fairy stories and talk about the Christian eucatastrophe. To this extent, Tolkien is he's okay. I really forgot what I was going to say. We're still thinking about why isn't this mythology more Christian, and sort of why isn't it more historical? In the terms that you might say, well, isn't Tolkien writing a Christian answer to paganism? Hard to say. Well, so what there's no fall. The men just show up on stage, and some of them kind of wander into the story. Literally, they wander into the story of the Noldor. But otherwise, the elves don't know much about the Christians. The elves don't know much about the men, and the driving problems in the story don't seem to be, certainly not in the Silmarillion, but they don't seem to be the men's. In the Hobbit, it's, men haven't really created the problem. Sauron did. He gave rings to the men kings, but the original fault, you could say, with Isildur for not destroying the ring in the first place. Is that another fall? It's weird that Tolkien doesn't do more directly with Christianity in his fairy story, because he said in his essay lecture on fairy stories that Christianity was a fairy story, right? And if you remember, when he's talking through the value of fairy tales and sort of power of fairy tales, one of the things he says at the end is, it's like we have this consolation in fairy tales, particularly the consolation of the happy ending, which he gives a neologism for of eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. The Latin scholars among you will know that he just said fairy stories are gospel, evangelium, good news, right? And he, in fact, says so in his epilogue, that the joy which he takes as the mark of the true fairy story is is not just fundamentally Christian, but that the gospel is, as he says, the fairy story that embraces all other fairy stories. I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect as to others of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful and moving, mythical in their perfect self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But, and this is, the sort of magnificence of the Christian story. So here's Tolkien saying, fairy stories are about eucatastrophe and this joy, turning the universal final defeat into joy beyond the walls of the world. And the Gospels contain a story of a larger kind which embraces all fairy stories. And indeed, to go further, this story, the Gospel story, is even more amazing because it has entered history and the primary world. Desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. And he's saying that in the Christian story, legend and history have met and fused. Christianity is the great fairy story. And yet, Tolkien didn't write one in those terms. He doesn't write about the fall directly. He has, the men come in from off stage, Year of the Sun, wake up, show up, elves don't know who they are. even in, in the long conversations they potentially have throughout the First Age, apparently the elves never really learned, and the men wouldn't say. It's like, why not include a more explicit Christian mythology? And what further interesting is, of course, Tolkien could have and purposely didn't, as he says yet again in the Milton Waldman story, saying, as I was thinking about this, it's like, what kind of story would you have if you had elves and men in it? Well, we've got a lot of them. I've been mentioning that I've been reading John C. Wright's Moth and Cobweb stories, and these got elves and men in them. You can have elves and men in a fantasy story and have it be Christian, but, and for Tolkien this was a problem, it ends up potentially Arthurian under those circumstances, right? When he's telling Waldman about wanting to write this mythology for England, one of the things he explicitly dismissed was the Arthurian stories. He says, for one thing, and this is an interesting thing to be upset about, but for one thing, these Arthurian stories, the fairy is too lavish and fantastical, incoherent, and repetitive. For another, and more important thing, it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. Okay, so we have here two completely different claims that Tolkien has made in sort of setting up the problems of his legendarium. On the one hand, on fairy stories, he says the fairy stories are evangelium, and the gospel, the Christian gospel, is in fact the evangelium of all evangelia, right? It is the great fairy story. It contains the eucatastrophe of history. And so we've had now the followers, the men, wake up in the year of the sun. They wake up in history. It should be history now. It should be we should be able to fold the elves into a story that involves the great fairy story, shouldn't we? Right? And I was saying, think of all the things you could, all the cool things you could do with the fairy story set in Christianity. And do not worry about whether or not this is like, blasphemous or inappropriate or something like that. It's like, well, now I've sort of puzzled myself. It can't be blasphemous to include the workings of Christianity in stories if the power in Christianity is actually real. I mean, for example, in the Archaven Comics Midnight War, right? I forgot that title, right? With the vampires and the blood, and the whole premise being that the blood of the baptized is bad for vampires. That seems to me a pretty cool story element, right? And I mean, even in things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, all she needs is a cross, right? You want you fight vampires, you fight the undead with Christian symbols. If you have stories of demons, and this Wright uses in his stories a lot, the name of Christ is a very, very powerful. Is it a magic spell? It's powerful against the forces of darkness, against the demons. The tales of the martyrs. The martyrs are always able in their confidence and their fortitude, one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, right? And their fortitude to stand up to all kinds of tortures and torments and so forth. They're standing up against the evil that can be thrown against them. This makes for fantastic storytelling. Why wouldn't you put that in your mythology? The ability to stand up against the horror seems to be the core of most of the fantasy literature that we're interested in reading, right? Witchcraft and demons, peanut butter and jelly, witchcraft and demons, holy water and crucifixes, right? Did Tolkien not want to do that because it just seemed too predictable? why not? I mean, far be it, far be it to say that Tolkien didn't take it on because he couldn't figure out a better way to do it. Well, it's a sort of interesting puzzle, because if you are, well, one, I think if you're within this Christian frame, there are certain things that need to happen and possibly can't happen. I mean, one of the things I thought about was, well, Tolkien simply loves elves so much, and elves in stories like A Midsummer Night's Dream, so the Shakespearean stories of elves, or of course the medieval tradition of elves, which we've talked about, have them as the enemies of human beings, and Tolkien wants to have the elves as the good guys, as it were. Although, I mean, okay, Fëanor falls, and therefore he's a bad guy, but he is the protagonist. You feel sorry for Fëanor because you wish he had chosen differently, right? You don't really feel sorry for Melkor. I don't think so. I don't think you feel sorry for Ungoliant. You're not set up within the story context to consider that Melkor or Ungoliant could make different choices about whether or not to kill the trees. Whereas you do feel, from Fëanor's perspective, that you wish he had not been marred. So Tolkien, creates this problem for himself, that he's given his sympathies to the elves, and the elves in all previous legendaria were the fearsome characters, right? And in fact, for example, in the Moth and Cobweb stories and John C. Wright stories, the elves, although they have great pageantry, right, because they're Arthurian elves, and there's a sense of, well, of course we're, going to take on the habits and forms of the Arthurian period. That's when human beings were at their best, right? But they're still evil in the sense that their purposes are not just opposed to human beings, but want to take power over the human beings. Tolkien, doesn't have that dynamic to play with, since he has taken the side, effectively, of the elves in his narrator's perspective, right? That he wants the Silmarillion to be the elf story, and so the human beings, but he doesn't want the human beings to show up as enemies either. They're just the younger children, and kind of embarrassing and frail. Does that make and I'd say there's a sort of irony here for Tolkien taking the side of the elves, because we know that the SJW position is always to take either to change the race of the characters, which we still haven't talked about in detail yet, but we can do that some other time, to take the side of the monsters, right? And in fact, that's what Tolkien did by taking the side of the elves. He took the side of the lords and ladies, the fair folk, the gentry. He took the side of the characters in all of this medieval legendaria, all the medieval legendaria, who would have been the enemy. Now that in itself makes it sort of complicated, but it still doesn't explain why he didn't wrestle as hard with the story of the fall of the human beings as he did with the fall of Melkor. I mean, he did the fall of the angels in fairly, great depth in thinking about exactly what the discord meant, and what kind of animosity Melkor would have towards the other Valar. He sets up Fëanor in this incredibly complicated situation, having been the cause of his mother's choosing to die, and being filled with this fire, and then not choosing to break the Silmarils so as to help the trees, and his covetousness, all of that, right? This is incredibly complex imagining on Tolkien's part about the processes of making, and the human beings are meant to be about these making characters, right? They're I have a word in my head now. These creatures that make things why doesn't he do as much with the human beings? Well, he did in fact draft a story which Andreth alludes to when she says perhaps the people of Adenel know a bit more, and it's not terribly long. It's just a few pages, and I think we can read through this and figure out why didn't Tolkien go further with his story. Well, then Andreth, being urged by Finrod, said at last, "This is the tale that Adenel of the house of Hildor told to me. Some say the disaster happened at the beginning of the history of our people, before any had yet died. The voice had spoken to us, and we had listened. The voice said, 'Ye are my children. I have sent you to dwell here. In time you will inherit all this earth. But first you must be children and learn. Call on me, and I shall hear, for I am watching over you.' We understood the voice in our hearts, though we had no words yet. Then the desire for words awoke in us, and we began to make them. But we were few, and the world was wide and strange. Though we greatly desired to understand, learning was difficult, and the making of words was slow. In that time we called often, and the voice answered, but it seldom answered our questions, saying only, 'First seek to find the answer for yourselves, for you will have joy in the finding, and so grow from childhood and become wise. Do not seek to leave childhood before your time.' But we were in haste, and we desired to order things to our will, and the shapes of many things that we wished to make awoke in our minds. Therefore we spoke less and less to the voice. Then one appeared among us in our own form, visible, but greater and more beautiful, and he said that he had come out of pity. 'You should not have been left alone and uninstructed,' he said. 'The world is full of marvelous riches which knowledge can unlock. You could have food more abundant and more delicious than the poor things that ye now eat. You could have dwellings of ease in which you could keep light and shut out the night. You could be clad even as I.' Then we looked, and lo, he was clad in raiment that shone like silver and gold, and he had a crown on his head and gems in his hair. 'If you wish to be like me,' he said, 'I will teach you.' Then we took him as teacher. He was less swift than we had hoped to teach us how to find or to make for ourselves the things that we desired, though he had awakened many desires in our hearts. But if any doubted or were impatient, he would bring and set before us all that we wished for. 'I am the giver of gifts,' he said, 'and the gifts shall never fail as long as ye trust me.' Therefore we revered him, and we were enthralled by him, and we depended upon his gifts, fearing to return to a life without them that now seemed poor and hard, and we believed all he taught. For we were eager to know about the world and its being, about the birds and the beasts, and the plants that grew in the earth, about our own making, and about the lights of heaven and the countless stars and the dark in which they are set. All that he taught seemed good, for he had great knowledge, but ever more and more he would speak of the dark. 'Greatest of all is the dark,' he said, 'for it has no bounds. I came out of the dark, but I am its master, for I have made light. I made the sun and the moon and the countless stars. I will protect you from the dark, which else would devour you.' Then we spoke of the voice, but his face became terrible, for he was angry. 'Fools,' he said, 'that was the voice of the dark. It wishes to keep you from me, for it is hungry for you.' Then he went away. We did not see him for a long time, and without his gifts we were poor. And there came a day when suddenly the sun's light began to fail, until it was blotted out, and a great shadow fell on the world, and all the beasts and birds were afraid. Then he came again, walking through the shadow like a bright fire. We fell upon our faces. 'There are some among you who are still listening to the voice of the dark,' he said, 'and therefore it is drawing nearer. Choose now. You may have the dark as Lord, or you may have me. But unless ye take me for Lord and swear to serve me, I shall depart and leave you. For I have other realms and dwelling places, and I do not need the earth nor you.' Then in fear we spoke as he commanded, saying, 'Thou art the Lord, thee only will we serve. The voice we abjure, and will not hearken to it again.' 'So be it,' he said. 'Now build me a house upon a high place, and call it the house of the Lord. Thither I will come when I will. Then ye shall call on me and make your petitions to me.' And when we had built a great house, he came and stood before the high seat, and the house was lit as with fire. 'Now,' he said, 'come forth, any who still listen to the voice.' There were some, but for fear they remained still and said not. 'Then bow before me and acknowledge me,' he said. And all bowed to the ground before him, saying, 'Thou art the one great, and we are thine.' Thereupon he went up as in a great flame and smoke, and we were scorched by the heat. But suddenly he was gone, and it was darker than night, and we fled from the house. Ever after we went in great dread of the dark, but he seldom appeared among us in fair form, and he brought few gifts. If at great need we dared to go to the house and pray to him to help us, we heard his voice and received his commands. But now he would always command us to do some deed or to give him some gift before he would listen to our prayer. And ever the deeds became worse and the gifts harder to give up. The first voice we never heard again, save once. In the stillness of the night it spoke, saying, Ye have abjured me, but ye remain mine. I gave you life. Now it shall be shortened, and each of you in a little while shall come to me to learn who is your Lord, the one ye worship, or I who made him. Then our terror of the dark was increased, for we believed that the voice was of the darkness behind the stars. And some of us began to die in horror and anguish, fearing to go out into the dark. Then we called on our master to save us from death, and he did not answer. But when we went to the house and all bowed down there, at last he came great and majestic, but his face was cruel and proud. Now ye are mine, and must do my will, he said. I do not trouble that some of you die and go to appease the hunger of the dark, for otherwise there would soon be too many of you, crawling like lice on the earth. But if you do not do my will, you will feel my anger, and you will die sooner, for I will slay you. Thereafter we were grievously afflicted by weariness and hunger and sickness, and the earth and all things in it were turned against us. Fire and water rebelled against us, the birds and beasts shunned us, or if they were strong they assailed us. Plants gave us poison, and we feared the shadows under trees. Then we yearned for our life as it was before our master came, and we hated him, but feared him no less than the dark. And we did his bidding, and more than his bidding, for anything that we thought would please him, however evil, we did in the hope that he would lighten our afflictions, and at the least would not slay us. For most of this was in vain. But to some he began to show favor, to the strongest and cruelest, and to those who went most often to the house. He gave gifts to them, and knowledge that they kept secret. And they became powerful and proud, and they enslaved us, so that we had no rest from labor amidst our afflictions. Then there arose some among us who said openly in their despair, Now we know at last who lied, and who desired to devour us. Not the first voice. It is the master that we have taken, who is the darkness. And he did not come forth from it, as he said, but he dwells in it. We will serve him no longer. He is our enemy. Then in fear, lest he should hear them and punish us all, we slew them, if we could. And those that fled we hunted, and if any were caught, our masters, his friends, commanded that they should be taken to the house, and there done to death by fire. That pleased him greatly, his friends said, and indeed for a while it seemed that our afflictions were lightened. But it is told that there were few that escaped us, and went away into far countries, fleeing from the shadow. Yet they did not escape from the anger of the voice, for they had built the house and bowed down in it. And they came at last to the land's end and the shores of the impassable water. And behold, the enemy was there before them. Now, this obviously does not become part of any of the story, right? It's like you would think, perhaps in the Lord of the Rings, that there would be some inkling that humanity had of having, worshipped wrongly. And I mean, one of the things that is always very puzzling for people about, Tolkien's fantasy more generally, but the Lord of the Rings specifically, it's like, where are the temples? Where is the worship? Fantasy literature to this day, modeling itself on Tolkien and people convincing themselves that he wasn't really Christian when he was writing it, because he purposely kept putting no Christianity in the story. And yet this story haunts all of Tolkien's legendarium. I mean, it's so fascinating to realize, and I realized it even more as I was just reading it for you, that this, I mean, he tells Waldman in the letter, right, that the is that in, sorry, I've forgotten where it is. He tells, it's in his letter saying that the theme of the Lord of the Rings is right worship, and effectively Ilúvatar's claim to right worship. And what Sauron does is what the enemy here tries to do. As we say, the not the voice, but the other, right? The one who they build a house for. That Sauron, attempts to enslave the world to his worship, much as in this story of the fall, the Melkor, the Morgoth, does with the human beings. It's there. This story is there, haunting all of Tolkien's legendarium, and yet he never wrote it properly, right? This is this tale of Adonel, the tale of Adonel, the one that Adonel tells Andreth, Andreth tells Finrod. It's in notes that Tolkien made to this Athrabeth, and it's not included when Christopher originally publishes the Silmarillion. It's that thing that, like, as with Andreth's unwillingness to tell Finrod what did you do, is so embarrassing to the human beings. I mean, they've seen the fall of the elves. We see the fall of the elves. We see their sin and humiliation and penance, and we never see the fall of humanity. I mean, it's there potentially reflected in the Unalindale and the fall of Fëanor and everything, but we never see the fall of humanity. Why not? Is it? And I had this. Okay, so clearly in the story, the voice in our hearts. There's scriptural references and scriptural allusions throughout that we hold God in our hearts, and the voice that speaks to us through our heart is the voice of our Creator. And it says to us, "You are my children. I've sent you to dwell here. In time you will inherit all the earth, but first you have to learn. Call on me, and I shall hear, for I am watching over you." But our learning is slow, right? We have this desire for understanding. We have this desire for knowledge, but we get frustrated, and it's hard for us to speak. I mean, this learning was difficult, and the making of words was slow. That we want to be able to articulate and understand things that we can't. And the voice says, well, but you have to seek to find the answer for yourselves, for you will have joy in the finding. And so grow from childhood and become wise. Do not seek to leave childhood before your time. It seems that the fall in this moment is the haste, right? And that fits with the Garden of Eden. And Tolkien worried in his own notes to this, saying it feels like it's too much parody. Right? So he's saying, is it not right to make Andreth refuse to discuss any traditions or legends of the fall? Already it is, if inevitably, too like a parody of Christianity. A legend of the fall would make it completely so. It's like, well, why couldn't you could say all of his storytelling is to a certain extent a parody of Christianity, and that he's retelling creation, and he's retelling the fall of the angels, and he's retelling the temptations, and there's trees and so forth. Why does this get him to the point where, you remember, this is Tolkien who wrote Mythopoeia for Lewis to convince him that there's truth in the myths, and that the great truth in the myth is that we make still by the law in which we're made. Why balk at telling the story of our impatience at being creatures, right? Our impatience at wanting to be making creatures, and our impatience at knowledge, which in the Garden of Eden is the temptation that Eve is given. You will be like gods, knowing good and evil. You will be like gods. Always the temptation, and that what Melkor comes and tempts them with is knowledge, right? It's like, you should not have been left alone and uninstructed. The world is full of marvelous riches which knowledge can unlock. This is the great temptation of modernity. Thinking about the huge temptations that we are laboring under right now, right? It's the impatience with death, obviously, the vaccines, and the promise of, if you take this vaccine, you will not die. which has backfires badly on too many people. You will, so many of the temptations, you can see them over and over and over again in our, genetic experiments, in our worries about, controlling the weather, if we could, all of our temptations. I mean, they feed out of, you can think of like Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, which, considering that the Númenórean story is the Atlantis story, you can fit a lot into this, that Francis Bacon imagines this island off in the Pacific, probably, where the Solomonic wisdom is being pursued in experiments, and there's this whole list of devices and machines and sciences that these New Atlanteans have developed, and that promise has been since the scientific revolution, since the mythology took over, the science mythology took over, trusting the science, right? That we shall be, but one, that no more patience and striving to learn, and slow development of understanding and appreciation of ourselves as children that need, mainly patience, I think, which is interesting, because that they were in haste, right? Remember, the Ints are not hasty. So our haste and there's a kind of gluttony of desire for our knowledge is the thing that's getting us presently into trouble. And to say, that Tolkien is writing for now, right? He's writing for modernity, and for modernity's sin. And modernity's sin, over and over and over again, is this graspingness at our making, which this little story, I think, encapsulates quite magnificently, right? That the Melkor appear, he's never named, right? He's just the liar, right? Telling them that the voice is the dark, and that he made the voices of the dark, and that he made the sun and the moon and everything. But what he promises, the giver of gifts, he says, I'm the giver of gifts, and that you'll have more food, more abundant, you'll have dwellings of ease in which you could keep light and shut out the night. You'd have clothing like I do. If you wish to be like me, I will teach you, and I'll give you gifts. And they become enthralled with him, and giving him more and more of their dependence. And we say we revered him when we were enthralled by him, when we depended upon his gifts, fearing to return to a life without them that now seemed poor and hard, and we believed all that he taught. Tolkien is there. He's very, very definitely pointing us away from this comfort, this ease. I mean, even saying, it's like the dwellings of ease in which you could keep light and shut out the night is the promise of the 19th and 20th centuries. The Crystal Palace exhibition, the Great World's Fair in the mid-19th century in Hyde Park in London. One of the things that the economist authors, the free trade authors writing about it, exulted in was how everybody was going to end up being able to live in crystal palaces, basically greenhouses, which is kind of funny because it's like glass houses, but that they would be light and airy, and everybody would be able to afford one. And now our skyscrapers are all steel and glass, just like the Crystal Palace, and we sort of get so used to all of these gifts that the Melkor promises us, and it binds us. All that he taught that seemed good, for he had great knowledge, but then he starts speaking against. He talks about the dark and makes us afraid, right? So that we are being shown to be afraid, be very afraid of that. I made the light, and you need to be afraid of the darkness. And that voice comes out of the dark. We become doubtful, we become fearful of the promise that we are the children of God, but we need to be patient, and we need to learn patiently rather than in haste. And once you've chosen the giver of gifts and take him for the Lord, well, here we get in some really dangerous territory story-wise, because they build him a house on a high place, right? Which, if you read the Old Testament carefully, you realize that's the Temple of Solomon, which fits with the Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, right? That the Solomonic wisdom was always this great temptation, and it's also, curiously enough, the temptation of magic. The Key of Solomon and the summoning of angels, and really truly all of the dark magic of the Middle Ages. I mean, one, it's and I've talked about this in previous episodes. We just keep bringing it all back in. That angel magic of the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, the Kabbalah magic, is about being able to name the angels and gain this wisdom. Well, what's interesting is not just so much parody of Christianity, that Tolkien is going to get very, very close to some pretty thorny theological debates that, again, I'm kind of thinking out loud in this episode. Why didn't he want to go there, right? Because what he is showing you, he's showing you very, very powerfully in this Tale of Adonel what false worship is like. That it comes with these promises of food and clothing and comfort. It turns you away from that voice in your heart. And when they build a house on the high place, call it the house of the Lord, it's the temple, and he comes to them when they call on him and make petitions, right? So here's Melkor setting him up basically as in the temple of Israel, right, in the temple of Jerusalem, and they bow before him and acknowledge him. And if they wanted something, they go to the house and pray to him to help us, and there they hear his voice and receive his commands. But then he starts commanding them to do some deed or to give him some gift before he's going to listen to our prayer. In other words, he starts asking for sacrifices and solving the problem that Finrod said Andreth wasn't able to address. It's like, well, but if Eru made you, then how can you die? It doesn't seem to be something that Melkor could do to you in your as you were created, right? It's the children of Ilúvatar are made by Ilúvatar. They're beyond the reach of Melkor's discord unless they do something. And at this point, that they stop hearing the voice in their hearts, that had come to them in their hearts, and it says, "You have abjured me, but you are still mine. I gave you life, now it shall be shortened, and then you'll come to me and you'll see what you should have to learn. You'll learn who the one that you're worshiping is. You'll come to me to learn who is your Lord, the one ye worship." So basically, Melkor is very definitely taking the role of the Lord of this world, which is what Finrod had said, right? That's in the opening passage that I read. It's like Andreth says, I've gotten confused. So Andreth says to Finrod, "We know, if ye do not, that the Nameless is Lord of this world." So Satan, right, is, Andreth says, "We know that is," and Finrod says, no. The Lord of this world is not he, not Melkor, but the one who made him, and his vice-regent is Manwe, the elder king of Arda, who is blessed. That Tolkien wants to give the elves better theology, right? That the elves actually know the Valar, and they know the relationship of the Valar to Ilúvatar, and it's the human beings that are misguided. But then, that, I think that does raise, for a Christian storyteller, some difficulties. It's like, how can the elves know better than human beings about the Creator? But they do, because the Valar told them about their singing, right? That's how we get the Ainulindale. That the Ainulindale tell the Ainulindale as the Valar tell the elves the story of creation. And So Tolkien has now created a problem for himself in which the human beings don't know the true story of creation. The elves know it better than they do. And the human beings have they're serving Melkor. They're serving Satan. And as they serve Satan, and this what happens to them in this tale will happen even more explicitly in the Fall of Numenor, that the more the people who still listen to the voice in their hearts resist, the more Melkor, the one that they've taken as Lord, demands sacrifices, including that they're going to slay those who resist him. Now, Tolkien has hereby given us a pretty clear snapshot of what happens when we worship Satan, when we worship the promises of the comfort and the ease and the hastiness and the instead of listening to that little voice in our hearts that says that you're my children, but you need to find these things out for yourselves. We go for the easy answer potentially in the one who appears to us and just tells us stuff, right? The whisperings of the fallen angels and their knowledge, and those fallen angels or Melkors set themselves up as the Lord and says, build me a house on a high place and call it the house of the Lord. I will come to you there. And that's literally what happens in the Old Testament description of the temple, both the tabernacle and the temple, where the Lord appears to his people. But here, Tolkien, it's worried about parodying the gospel. He's parodying potentially, or is he stripping bare and showing what? That the worship offered to the Lord in the temple was incorrect. Now that, never mind, putting Christianity into the story and, having witches and demons and vampires bested by crosses and holy water. One, I guess, it's too easy. They're just driven away. It's like, here's the holy water, bang, you're fried. Here, Tolkien has stepped over into how do you distinguish this worship from the appropriate worship that we are meant to give our Creator. Well, how did he manage to write himself into such a corner? If you say, he said the Arthurian stories are too Christian in his telling, and I was thinking, okay, so what makes a fairy story Christian? What makes an Arthurian romance fundamentally Christian? And then you realize, so what's the sort of focus of a fairy story if it's going to be a Christian story and not simply a pre-Christian story, which is what Tolkien said he was wanting to do? Well, the centerpiece of the Arthurian legendarium, insofar as it's Christian, is of course the Grail, right? The Holy Grail, the Grail that held the blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. There's a whole backstory to how that Grail story develops. Richard Barber's The Holy Grail is a very good book to look at if you want that. But the core of it is to say a Christian fantasy, as opposed to, well, I'm not sure there's any other fantasy. A Christian fantasy, the core is about seeing the divine, right? The Grail is, you can only see it if you're pure and, Galahad needs to be chaste and so forth. But the Christian mystery is all about seeing God, right? And going back to, we're made in the image and likeness of our Creator. The great longing in Christianity, the reason that we long to be saved and cleansed of sin, the joy, that turning that Tolkien pointed to on fairy stories that comes to us in the gospel, need you to grasp onto this, is because we see the Lord. It's fundamentally mystical, right? It's like you could say, why don't more writers write Christian fantasy? And it's like, well, Christian fantasy tends to travel under a different name. It's mysticism, right? It's the longing for the vision, the longing for, if you write an authority romance, you end up in the Grail Chapel, right? There's kind of no other place that you can end those, because that's the thing you want most, right? The great longing of the human heart. You say, the voice in our hearts that speaks to us. The great longing is to see the speaker, to see the word, to see the face in whose image and likeness we are made. So a Christian fantasy is going to be more than just driving away the vampires with holy water or the cross, or being able to resist attacks, the sort of fortitude and strength. It's like you put on the armor of God and you're going to be able to fight and win. But the winning in a Christian story is going to be about the vision that we get of our Maker. And when I realized that, then I realized the question was not just sort of why didn't Tolkien want to put something about the right worship of Christianity, the right worship that the human beings ought to be offered. He wanted to be, absolutely historical, and he was putting all of his timelines in a pre-AD temporal moment, even though he's playing with the years of Valinor that are very much longer than the tree year, the sun years. The tree years are longer than the sun years, and the men wake up in the sun years. And so he wants it all to be historical, and so you can say, okay, he wants it all to be pre-Christian in those terms. But he doesn't even want there to be prophets that of the human beings that see God. It doesn't get he doesn't let the Valar speak to them, except for potentially possibly Melkor, which is that just ends up in the notes and the drafts, and it's not actually there. That what's so interesting is, he makes Fairy the blessed realm, the Valinor, where the Valar live, and the trees and the light, and you could say we've been doing this whole sort of mystical contemplation of the Laurelin and Telperion, the trees of the light, and I suggested that they're like the trees of paradise, and there are ways in which the Silmaril are like the crystal in the monstrance that's holding the host, and the light is shining there in the heavens, and you say all of this should have been Grail-like, right? It should have been at some point the reality of our being creatures made in the image and likeness of our Creator potentially breaks through, and we get that eucatastrophe, we get that joy of the turning, the seeing of our Maker. Why doesn't Tolkien? Hey, love. Now I have my husband on the camera. Why doesn't Tolkien put that in the story? He sets it up, I think, in the same text that we've been looking at, the Athrobed Finrod of Andreth, when he does give Andreth the possibility of saying, well, we do know some other stories, and there is this hope, but we're not sure what to make of it. And Finrod asks her, what then was this hope, if you know? They say, whereas I think fundamentally Tolkien's not wanting to do prophecy, which is frustrating, but right. They say, answered Andreth, they say that the One will himself enter into Arda and heal man and all the marring from the beginning to the end. This they say also, or they feign, is a rumor that has come down through years uncounted, even from the days of our undoing. Right, so there's the fall, and there is this rumor that the One will himself enter into Arda. They say they feign, said Finrod. Are you not then one of them? How can I be, Lord? All wisdom is against them. Who is this one? Who is the one whom ye call Eru? If we put aside the men who serve the nameless, as do many in Middle-earth, still many men perceive the world only as a war between light and dark, equipotent. But you will say, nay, that is Manwe and Melkor. Eru is above them. Is then Eru only the greatest of the Valar, a great god among gods, as most men will say, even among the Atani? A king who dwells far from his kingdom and leaves lesser princes to do here much as they will? Again you say, nay, Eru is one, alone without peer, and he made Ea, and so is beyond it, and the Valar are greater than we, but yet no nearer to his majesty. Is this not so? Yes, said Finrod, we say this, and the Valar we know, and they say the same, all save one. But which think you is more likely to lie, those who make themselves humble, or he that exalts himself? I do not doubt, said Andreth, and for that reason the saying of hope passes my understanding. How could Eru enter into the thing he made? Excuse me, this is the big passage and I bungled it. Right, okay, try again. How could Eru enter into the thing that he has made, and than which he is beyond measure greater? Can the singer enter into his tale, or the designer into his picture? He is already in it as well as outside, said Finrod, but indeed the indwelling and the outliving are not in the same mode. Truly, said Andreth, so may Eru in that mode be present in Ea that proceeded from him. But they speak of Eru himself entering into Arda, and this is a thing wholly different. How could he, the greater, do this? Would it not shatter Arda, or indeed all Ea? The problem that Tolkien had in writing a Christian fantasy was not the fall, which he writes over and over and over again. It's the incarnation. And you remember that was what he said on fairy stories was the great mystery, right? It was the great reason that you can understand the gospel as, in fact, a fairy tale. That the birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history, because the story has entered history and the primary world. And he says this, the Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but is preeminently, infinitely, if our capacity were not finite, high and joyous. But this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. It's the incarnation that's the great seeing of God. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us so that we see. And Tolkien has his characters acknowledge that this is something beyond understanding. Would it not shatter Arda, indeed all of Ea? No Christian fantasy that I know of, not even in the Narnia, which have their greatness, but it's of a different sort, deals with this element of the mystery. It's not just, whether we can fight demons, or whether, if you try to summon a demon, you end up serving the Dark Lord. That, and Andreth says, men perceive, most men simply see men perceive the world only as a war between light and dark, equipotent, Manwe and Melkor, and therefore, this Eru, this one outside of everything, well, he doesn't seem to really feature in the story at all. And this hope, this story that, some say, is that Eru himself will somehow enter into the thing he made. How could that possibly be? Who could believe such a tale? Do you? I will leave you with that question, to be continued. Thank you for joining me.